So we are going to be recording this session for those who can't make it. But the other thing that interested me and why I thought that Cantor Allen would be a good speaker for us is because the congregation that she leads is very much like Temple Beth Torah. It's in Arlington, which is a suburb of Dallas, like our synagogue is a suburb of Houston. And it's affiliated with the Reform movement, but it's about the size of our congregation. You know, they have roughly 80 to 90 households, as do we. And they've been around about as long as we have. They also started in the early 80s. And so it's a very similar kind of congregation. And I don't know if the population is similar, but I did think this was a very timely subject. Cantor Allen has been with Congregation Beth Shalom in Arlington for 11 years as the spiritual leader. She is both the cantor and the religious leader of the synagogue. We call it kolbo in the industry, meaning that she leads the prayers and leads the synagogue in every way. She's also, in addition to some of her activism work, she's also on the, I believe it's called the Ethics Committee of the Cantor's Assembly. And so she's going to tell you a little bit more about herself and why this particular subject has a particular interest for her. And we also have some slides that we're going to share with you with vocabulary and terminology. So for now, I'm going to hand it over to Cantor Sheri Allen.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Gordon. It really is a pleasure and really an honor to be here tonight. This is an issue that I am very passionate about, and I'll tell you why. I'll tell you a little bit about myself first. Like Rabbi Gordon said, I've been with my congregation for a while. This is my 12th year. I'm only part-time though, so I do other work too. I'm a chaplain for the Jewish patients at Vitas Hospice, and I do presentations and things around the community about different things, about Jewish end of life care, and I'm involved in other issues too. But so I wanted to talk to you tonight because my story, I'm going to start out with my story as a personal one, and this is really sort of what ignited the spark to that has led me toward where I am right now in terms of this issue. So first of all, my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I remember when I first started putting that on my signature, my congregants were quite, confused. Like, well, why? We know. I'm like, well, this is kind of like a sign for others to say, I'm not going to assume at all what gender you identify with. And I'm going to tell you what gender then I don't want you to assume that same thing for me too. So kind of like a little, I don't know, just shout out to them. And really the reason why this is so close to my heart is because I have 3 children and they just cover the rainbow spectrum. I have my son, Jeremy, who's 32, is a cisgender gay man. My daughter, Emily, who is 30, is a cisgender bisexual woman. And my son, Preston, who is, going to be 28 next month, is a transgender queer man. So for those of you that are like, I've heard some of those terms, but I'm really not quite sure about all of them. And I wasn't that sure about all of them not too long ago myself. I wanted to kind of explain that first. But just say that my kids are all amazing, wonderful, wonderfully, beautifully functioning adults. None of them live in Texas, unfortunately. My son Jeremy lives in Manhattan, and my daughter is in Nashville, and my other son is in Chicago. So we cover this part of the country anyway. So I want to begin really with explaining to you, because it's important, I think, in order to be, at least it was for me, to be a welcoming congregation, which I, of course, insisted on. Couldn't lead a congregation that wouldn't welcome my own children, basically. So yeah, I'm very insistent that we are welcoming, and we do it by in what we say and in what we do, in our speech and in our actions. you kind of have to navigate the vocabulary a little bit. So the first thing I want to do is share, Rabbi Gordon made a wonderful PowerPoint that has some terminology that basically explains how I define my kids, and goes a little bit further. So when we have that PowerPoint up, I think it's going to share the screen. We'll go through this quickly first. All right. So if you can go to the next slide. The first thing we're going to do, this is actually the name of this whole the PowerPoint is naming multiple identities. So what does it mean? What does that actually mean? Well, there's a difference between sex and gender identity and gender expression and sexual orientation. So I'm going to kind of just give you the 5-minute version of that. So when we say, sex, the sex is the sex you're assigned at birth based on anatomy. So female, male, or other, intersex. Intersex is basically a general term used to refer to people who have atypical sexual or reproductive anatomy in biology. That's basically the terminology we use. So, are you having a boy or a girl? That big question when someone's pregnant, I often ask instead, because I thought that I had 2 girls and a boy. Turns out one of my girls was, that was the sex assigned at birth, but that wasn't who he was. So I always say, I'd rather ask, what sex is your child assigned? and we can take it from there. And in fact, another, just an interesting side note, I was at a Cantor's Assembly convention, and there was a very, very pregnant Cantor there. And someone said, oh, are you having a boy or a girl? And she just said, I'm going to let them decide. So I thought it was brilliant. Next we have, if you can go to the next slide. So sex assigned at birth. Then we have gender identity. Okay, so gender identity basically is how you see yourself, how you identify. So who you go to bed as, female, woman, girl, male, man, boy, or other genders. Transgender, which is someone who identifies with the gender other than the gender they were assigned at birth, or the sex they were assigned at birth. Genderqueer is someone who self-identifies their gender as queer or non-normative. So someone whose gender might not be either man nor woman, or is beyond or between genders, rejects the gender binary altogether, or is some combination of genders. Cisgender is someone who identifies with the gender assigned at birth, that they have been assigned at birth, either male or female. Non-binary rejects the notion of a binary gender, of either you're male or you're female, and really sometimes can be used interchangeably with genderqueer as well. Next slide. Gender expression is how you present yourself to others, how you want others to see you. So the terminology surrounding this is either masculine, feminine, or other, or, perhaps, you're not, it's more fluid than that. Next slide. Okay, orientation. Who you're physically attracted or emotionally attracted to. So whereas gender identity is who you go to bed as, orientation is who you go to bed with. So the terminology can be either gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer, which is an umbrella term used by some to describe just LGBTQ people in general, or a term used to describe a sexual orientation that is not straight, without indicating the genders of the queer person or people they are attracted to. And most importantly, though, this word, which used to have very negative connotations, has been reclaimed by the LGBTQ community mostly as a positive affirmation of their identity. Pansexual is someone who's attracted toward persons of all gender identities or biological sexes and deliberately rejects the gender binary. Heterosexual is someone that is attracted to someone, obviously, of the opposite sex. Asexual, someone who doesn't experience sexual attraction at all. And the term homosexual is really, I put it up there because it's an outdated term. Okay, that used to be the term of choice, but gay is really the preferential term, as far as I know, meaning that you are attracted to someone of a different identity than yourself. So anyway, any questions about any of this so far? And I can't really see who's asking. So Daniel, have to, if there's any questions, if you can just, or put them in the chat.
Right. So you
or-
can either put a question in the chat, or you can unmute yourself to ask a question. But just for clarification, because I was unfamiliar with cisgender, which my understanding is that someone who was born male and continues to be male is cis male.
So yeah, so that's why, yeah, I in fact, I was too. But this is something I learned from my kids. I learned so much of this from my kids. So when I say my son Jeremy is a cisgender gay man, that means he identifies with the sex assigned to him at birth, which is male. He's gay, so he's attracted to other men. This is sexual attraction, and you know, and he's a man. He identifies as a man, cisgender gay man. Emily, cisgender bisexual woman. So my daughter Emily, also identifies with the sex assigned to her at birth, which is female, but she's bisexual. She's attracted, you know, to both men and women. Now, at the moment, well, not at the moment, I think this is going to be permanent. She is living with her boyfriend, and they just bought their first house together, and it looks like they're going to be engaged soon. So so she will most likely end up marrying a man. And then Preston, my son, is transgender, so does not identify with the sex that he was assigned at birth, which was female. Now he identifies as male. And queer, meaning that he doesn't just, you know, he's more fluid in terms of who he's attracted to, not necessarily men or women, sometimes both, you know. So he prefers just not to label himself as being attracted to any other particular gender. So does that explain?
So your daughter identifying herself as bisexual means that she could be attracted to either, but because she fell in love with and might marry a man, then if she believes in monogamy, then she'll end up in that, what we would call a straight relationship.
And she's very, I mean, she's very adamant about still saying and identifying herself as bisexual, even though she is, you know, in love with a man. You know, she's had other relationships with women before too. This is the person though that she's really fallen in love with. So, you know, yeah. And she does a lot of photography. She's very well known in the Nashville area because she's a photographer. She does a lot of photography for the trans community. And in fact, her photography was featured in Out magazine back in the summer. And she does really wonderful work, but she wants to make sure that people really understand who she is, and know that just because she is dating a man and most likely will marry him does not mean that she's not bisexual.
And is gay a term for either men or women?
I'm sorry?
Gay would be a term for, you could be a gay man or a gay woman.
I think that is kind of like more, yeah, it's kind of, I think it can be used for both, yeah.
And homosexual would also be someone who's attracted to someone of the same sex.
It's just that term is outdated.
So the other question I would have, and I don't want to dominate the questions, but because, you know, some of this is familiar to me, some of it is new to me. What would the difference be between someone who identifies as pansexual and someone who identifies as bisexual?
Pansexual, you know, basically means that it doesn't, the gender of the person doesn't matter at all. You know, there is no, they're not looking at gender. They can be attracted to they're attracted to the human being that they are, not the gender that they are, or the biological, assigned at birth sex. It's more the person. And it's confusing me. All these terms, and these aren't even all the terms. There are more.
The other term that I've heard that's not on the list is gender fluid.
Gender fluid, right? Exactly. Which means, again, kind of the same thing. I would imagine you can use maybe. Well, I wish I had Preston here because he could really. But it means and again, it's gender is fluid in terms of maybe. Sometimes someone identifies more, as a female, but then maybe not so much the next day. It's their gender isn't really a big thing. I guess that's probably the bottom line. That it's not that important. That they don't necessarily feel like the gender that they perhaps identify with at that moment necessarily will be that gender later on.
So can you speak a little bit about, and you and I have had private conversations about this, but about where does this fit into Jewish teaching?
To
Jewish teaching, to what Judaism teaches.
Well, that's where I'm going to talk about. That's where I'm headed there. So how does this fit into Jewish teaching, and how, because again, there's been so much damage done, I think, by all, religion in terms of when it comes to, and when it comes to this. There are three verses theologically that people may use to justify homophobia or transphobia. And just, as you probably all know, once you start translating from the Hebrew to the English, you start interpreting. Okay, so, when people say, well, this is what it says in the Bible, and this is what it says in the Torah, so how can you X, Y, Z? Well, does it really say that? Can you look at it in different ways?
I'm just going to interject one phrase here that I heard that was attributed to Abraham Joshua Heschel, a scholar of the 20th century, who was known to have said, by the time the Torah was translated into Hebrew, it was already Midrash. In other words, God's words, even when we put it into Hebrew, which we think is the original, how do we know exactly God's intent?
Right. What, once God transmitted it, to whoever, it was interpretation right there. Right, exactly. So you might be familiar with Leviticus 18:22. Do not lie with a male as one lies with a woman. It is an abhorrence. Or Leviticus 20, verse 13. If a man lies with a male as one lies with a woman, the two of them have done an abhorrent thing. They shall be put to death. Their blood guilt is upon them. Well, it seems kind of pretty much straight, dry. It's just, how can you argue with that, right? Well, you can. So how does Judaism, it's not as clear cut as you would think. How does Judaism address these texts in a way that accepts and affirms LGBTQ people? So there are some really interesting contemporary interpretations that I've studied, and these are always my go-to. I love Rabbi Rachel Barenblatt. She's otherwise known as the Velveteen Rabbi. And she comments when talking about Leviticus 18, what is done in the land of Egypt, wherein you were settled, you are not to do. What is done in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you, you are not to do. By their laws, you are not to walk. So it's just that this is a way of saying, don't be like those pagan nations that you are living near, that are your neighbors, right? They do things like this because they, it's not it has something to do with loving relationships, right? A lot of these things are cultic pagan practices, and a lot of it is, kind of around violent action and that kind of thing. So, and ritual prostitution, that was part of Canaanite religious culture and part of Egyptian religious culture too. So it's arguable that Leviticus 18:22 refers to pagan same-sex temple rituals that are that are kind of relationships and kind of things that again based on violence or that we reject. It's a combination of idolatry, in other words. That a lot of this had to do with idolatrous practices as well, right?
And when you mention violence, that would also connect with the Sodom and Gomorrah piece.
Exactly, right.
Where the people who came into Sodom and Gomorrah, it wasn't about homosexual monogamous love.
Right.
It was about dominance and violence.
And rape, yeah, exactly. So we all know
In fact, Cantor, the Talmud, the piece that you talked about the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, some of that refers to, because the Torah talks about men, doesn't talk about women.
Exactly, yeah.
But also there's a lot of specific things about sexuality in the Talmud. And what I found interesting was that it gets very specific in the Talmud about sexual acts that are permitted. And it seems like the only sexual act that is not permitted between a husband and wife is force, is non-consensual relations.
Right. So this would all lead back. This is all like proof texts, for the fact that this is not talking about loving relationships here. This is talking about acts of violence or domination or idolatry, pagan rituals that we did not want to emulate, right? It's not so. And then of course, let's go back to the first commandment: be fruitful and multiply, right? This commandment couldn't be fulfilled with two men, so it was maybe also, you can interpret it as like a survival of the fittest thing. So this commandment maybe it was all about procreation. Okay, you can't kids are that's the goal. We gotta be fruitful and multiply. Sands on the ocean, stars in the sky, kind of thing. It's not going to happen with same-sex couples. So perhaps this was a way to say, same-sex relationship upsets the existing social order and clearly defines gender roles of Jewish life. That was definitely what it was all about back then, and this would kind of upset that. So it was a way of just saying, okay, let's make sure we know what our priorities are. Be fruitful and multiply. Right? Rabbi David Greenstein, who is at Congregation Shomrei Emunah in Montclair, New Jersey, has therefore also offered some alternative English translations of both verses from Leviticus, and these are really interesting. 18:22, he interprets as, and along with another male, you shall not lie in forced sexual intercourses with a woman. It is an abomination. So this prohibition is against a man joining with another male partner in order to gang rape a woman. That's how he sees it. And then 2013, he translates as, any man who shall lie along with another male and force sexual intercourses with a woman, both of them, the men, have done an abomination. These two men shall surely die, their blood guilt upon them. So the death penalty is explicitly directed at the two perpetrators of the rape. So that's how he frames it. Another verse used to justify homophobia, Deuteronomy 22:5 from Kitei say, a woman should not put on the apparel of a man, nor should a man wear the clothing of a woman, for whoever does these things, it is a toeva, completely off limits behavior to the eternal your God. So one contemporary interpretation of that, of cross-dressing, shall we say, cross-dressing perhaps is prohibited when used as a disguise to invade someone else's space. So in other words, this is about intention here. The prohibition is intended also to keep maybe women from going to war. Or also, again, about prohibiting adultery. Cross-dressing is permitted, however, for the purpose of joy. So in other words, if it's for a nefarious reason, your purpose is to hurt someone, to harm them, then no, that's forbidden. But hey, if it makes you happy and you're not and you're not hurting anyone, then go for it. So again, that's just a contemporary, and I got that from actually an article I read on keshetonline.org. You know, Keshet is the LGBTQ advocacy organization for the Reform movement. And it's under, if you want to just Google trans texts, cross-dressing and drag, that's their take on it. So really, the verse prohibits hiding your true self. Also, you know, we can go back to the Torah and say, you know, there are portrayals of God as actually non-binary also. Okay, there is a resource called Trans Texts, Queerly Created, created by rabbis Reuben Zellman and Elliot Kukla, which explore what traditional Jewish texts have to say about transgender and gender nonconforming experiences and gender in general. And they point to this sentence: God created the Adam in God's image. In the image of God, God created him, male and female. God created them. It says so in the Torah. Yeah. So again, you know, there are portrayals in the Torah of humans being created as non-binary, right? So commentators through the ages have considered the possibility that God's first human creation was male or bigender or intersex or non-gendered. And the first human being, according to Genesis Rabbah 8:1, the first human being was created wholly female and wholly male at the same time. Genesis Rabbah also says the first human being was half male and half female and was then split into two separate beings. Another interpretation. And a third interpretation from that same text, the first human being was an infinite genderless mass. So, you know, it really, it's not so cut and dried. It's not, Torah says this. Well, what's not to say the Torah says that? But no matter what the interpretation, the Torah clearly affirms that all human beings are created b'Tselem Elohim, right, in the image of God. And Elohim, by the way, one of God's names, is plural. So there you go. And there are other really good resources that I found. One called Torah Queries, Queeris, the weekly commentaries on the Hebrew Bible. And they bring together some of the world's leading rabbis, scholars, and writers to interpret the Torah through what they call a bent lens. And it's an incredibly rich collection of that unites the voices of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and straight allied writers, including some of the most central figures in contemporary American Judaism. And all bring to the table unique methods of reading and interpreting that allow the Torah to speak to modern concerns on sexuality, identity, gender, and LGBTQ life. So that's a great place to kind of explore a little bit. Mishkan Ga'ava is a brand new publication from CCAR Press. It's called Where Pride Dwells. It is a beautiful collection of prayers and reflections that speak to, and Rabbi Jay Weinstein has a copy right there. That's great because I forgot to drag mine to the table. There you go. Can you put it a little bit closer to the screen so everyone can see? There you go. Oh gosh, it's absolutely beautiful. And there are prayers for every single occasion. There's a prayer for coming out to your family. You know, there's a prayer for having surgery. It just before getting married, you know, it runs together. It's beautiful. And then two sidurim two sidurim that I often will reference and actually use some of the English Sidur B'Kol Levavcha. Okay, great. And that one is from Is it CBST? Yeah. CBST, one of my favorite. In fact, I'm taking several classes with them right now. Congregation Beit Simchat Torah in New York, in Manhattan. My son introduced me to that synagogue. It's where he attends when he attends the synagogue. And is that Siddur Sha'ar Zahav? Yep, I got that one too. Those are the two. Thank you, Rabbi Weinstein. Yes, those are the two. I refer to them a lot. They have great prayers for special occasions. Some of their reinterpreting of some of the Hebrew and some of the prayers is beautiful as well. But my son, when he was able to go to synagogue, or when he was able to go, goes to CBST. Sharon Kleinbaum is their rabbi. She's amazing. And obviously, and if you're straight, you can go too. They won't kick you out. So I love to go there when I'm there. I'm taking, like I said, several classes, a psalm class there, and I'm in a prayer class there as well now online. And again, these are places where Jews, especially LGBTQ Jews, can really feel accepted, welcomed, celebrated, which obviously is so important. I also reference another book called Trans Torah, which provides ritual and liturgy and essays and sermons and poems and videos or art, and of course there's Keshet. I mentioned them before, the Jewish Reform organization that supports LGBTQ equality in Jewish life, and it has a list of Torah commentaries interpreted through an LGBTQ lens. We have a gay synagogue in Dallas, Beth El Bina. And Don Kroll, who's also a Cantor, and their Kolbo is the spiritual leader of Beth El Bina. So again, that's another place in Texas. So I'll stop now and ask if there's any questions that anyone has about anything so far we talked about. Oh, well.
Just one piece of information. There is a Keshet organization in Houston. It's not its own congregation. What they did when synagogues were open, which they're not now, is they would often gather at a different synagogue every month, and they visited Temple Beth Torah a few times. I guess I'm curious. We haven't had any people come in with specific questions. I'm wondering what you would say to people who just aren't used to differences.
Aren't used to differences?
Aren't used to differences. That this is that a lot of this is brand new. That just a couple of years ago, men marrying men and women marrying women became the law of the land, and a lot of people got used to it very quickly, but not everybody. And the transgenders and the non-binary people, it's just very new. Things like getting used to people who would prefer a pronoun being plural, like being referred to they instead of him or her.
And actually that we got in trouble a lot because our son Preston, as he was going through this was kind of gender fluid for a while. He always thought that he was just a lesbian, as a woman, but he always really was very uncomfortable in his body. He thought he struggled with his weight most of his life, and thought it was just that all these curves and all this weight. He thought it was just a weight issue. He dieted all the time. When he realized, wait, no, I just don't like the body that I'm in here. It was like a revelation. But for a while, he identified as non-binary, and he wanted to have us use the pronouns they, them. And that is really, really hard to get used to because, again, it's plural. but it's very, those terms are very acceptable now, not to us older folk, you know, but my other kids, I mean, and, you know, I go to schools and or my Hebrew students, they have no problem with just, you know, morphing into they, them and plural, you know, language. It's just so hard for us to wrap our minds around. But if you think about it, and I tell people, if you think about it, like if you have an interview with someone coming up, you don't know, you know, their name is Jamie. You don't know if they're a woman or a man. And you say, oh, I got an interview in 5 minutes. They're coming into my office in just a few minutes. You know, you would use they. You would use they all the time for that kind of thing, right? Oh, they're on their way, when you only mean one person. So that, you know, that kind of helped a little bit, but it was hard, and we misgendered him a lot, you know, and then finally, then he, you know, when he realized, no, I identify as being, you know, a transgender man, then at least I had to get, you know, used to he and him and not misgender him as she, her, which was hard because, you know your child, you know, for 26 years as she, you know, and all of a sudden now they're you have to call them by a different pronoun, a different name. And it is an adjustment, but she was basically like, you know, he was very patient and he gave us time. And then after, you know, like 6 months, he's like, okay, get over it. You got to try harder. You got to use the language more. And really, I think that would be my answer to people that are uncomfortable or whatever. You put yourself in situations where you can use this language more, or that you are, you know, you come in contact with, or you meet other LGBTQ people or transgender, you know, that when it becomes personal, when it's not just those people out there that, oh, we don't know anyone, you know, when I first told my congregation that I really wanted to make sure that we were educated properly, they're like, well, we don't have any trans people. We don't have any LGBTQ people in our synagogue. I'm like, you want to bet? Just because they're not telling you does not mean they're not here. And you cannot assume anything about anyone. So, you know, it's really a matter of, and so what I did with my congregation to get those people more comfortable, I talk about my kids all the time. One of my Yom Kippur sermon was about, you know, teshuvah, change, returning to your true self. Told the Preston story and how we got here. And they had all known Preston for years, right? Not as Preston. Well, Preston was who Preston was all along, but they knew Preston by the gender Preston was assigned at birth, right? But that made it real to them. This was Preston. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that I did recently was, we have a Gabbai guide. You know, Gabbai is the person that calls someone up to the Torah, and you usually call a person by bar, you know, Ben or Bat, right? So and so, Ben, so and so Bat. So, well,
husband or son of or daughter of.
Right, son or daughter of, right? For a while, Preston was they, them. How am I going to call? You know what? They came to visit, you know, every once in a while, Passover, Thanksgiving. I drag them to services. So we decided I was going to change. I was going to add. I wasn't going to take anything away, but I was going to add another option. And so instead of saying, you know, ta'amod, or, you know, ya'amod, which means, you know, to the female or the virgin, we'll call up so and so, son of so and so. La'amod, na'amod, meaning we will call now, blah, 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 me bait, blah, 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 from the house of so and so. So we're not saying son of or daughter of, we're saying from the house of, you know. And that's why we got pushback. I got pushback. I'm like, well, this is just too, you know, again, you know, we can't do that. And I said to them, so you mean that if my son, if all the time, if Preston was, you know, identifying as non-binary, if you mean Preston came in and I wanted to give Preston an aliyah, you wouldn't call them up by the pronouns that they choose to identify by? You're not going to do that for them? And then what? But it's Preston. Well, yeah, of course we're going to do that for them. It's Preston. And since then, Preston, you know, has spoken. and given some very Preston's a writer also. He writes musicals actually. So he's very powerful speaker and writer and advocate. He's spoken to my congregation about his experiences, about what, being trans is all about. And they've come to understand and learn because they know him now. So I think it's really that personal connection is so important.
I think that is a very, very key point, because almost anything is strange to us until we have a personal connection. Very similar to people who've never met a Jew. If you've never met a Jew, you don't know what one is. And we have people in Texas who have never met a Jew. That so if you've never met a trans person, then it's easier to be confused. But if you know somebody, especially if you know somebody and then find out later that they are now identifying with a different gender than they were born with, then and I have had that experience where I met somebody for the first time who was a transgender man. He had surgery, he had a beard, and he had been born a woman, but I had never met him as a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, he was always male in my experience.
Right.
Rabbi Gordon, can you hear me?
Yes, Herbert, go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi Gordon, and thank you, Cantor. Alan, may I turn the question, and if you don't wish to deal with it, I fully understand. How did you and your husband, on starting to learn about each of your children, sexuality, how did it affect you personally? How did it affect you? Did it affect your marriage? And how did it affect how you dealt with each different situation? Thank you.
Oh, thanks. That's a great question. Oh, of course I'll answer that. Yeah. I mean, there's really nothing you can't ask me. My life is an open book. So our oldest, Jeremy, we knew Jeremy was gay by the time he was like 2. I mean, it was just so, we were just waiting, for Jeremy, had never really identified with quote unquote boy things, right? He is an artist too, so he loved to draw Disney princesses. He loved to play with dolls. He loved wearing his pink footy pajamas. He loved to vacuum and mop around the house. My parents, and they came around. I mean, they no one could be more accepting of Jeremy than my parents. But at the time, here they had an experience with this too. It was like, just why don't you go throw a football around the backyard with him? Just like, let's play some sports. They bought him a superhero cape, a red superhero cape, so he could pretend he's. What did Jeremy use it for? His long flowing red hair. His skirt that he used to dance in. We just knew Jeremy, and he didn't come out to us until high school, right? But there was a time, my husband's a New Yorker, and we go to New York all the time to visit family. And and my husband, Richard, walked around the village one day with him and said, Jeremy, if you ever decide that you're gay, you can live here. It's a great place. And Jeremy never forgot that. We made it very clear from the time, again, this was even on Jeremy's radar, anyone's radar, that you can be whoever you want to be, however you want it. The dressing thing was a problem because sometimes he was very sad. Why can't I dress up in dresses and go to school? Well, now that that wouldn't be so much of a problem. My daughter Emily works in a Montessori school where kids can dress however they like. But back when Jeremy, was 3 years ago, I said, you know what? It's really sad that you can't, dress up as a girl to go to school and that's just the world that we're living in now. But when you're at home, you can dress up however you want. Hopefully someday there'll be a day when you can do that. But he'd go all out on Purim, I'll tell you that. Eventually, and we thought he was trans. We thought he really wanted to be a girl. I mean, that all signs point to that. And then he realized, no, he's, he's gay, he's a man, and he just has a really great fashion sense. And now he works at he's an editor of the New York Times, and he's designed their pride section for the last 3 years. So he's, and he has a boyfriend who's a doctor, and they're doing great. But I think, to answer your question about how we dealt with it, we just knew so early on that it was just like, this is who Jeremy is. It was just like not even something we had to get adjusted to. That was him. That was who he was. My daughter Emily, we weren't so we thought that she was heterosexual, and she had boyfriends and all of that. It wasn't until later that she said, but then looking back on it, it made sense. She always had like these girl crushes at school too, and she we just thought, oh, she admired these older role models, but it went deeper. And she admitted to us years later that she would write in her journal, what if I'm gay? And she was really scared about it. She didn't have to be, but maybe in her mind she thought, okay, well, Jeremy's the gay one, I have to be the straight one. But when she told us that, we were like, okay, that's fine. Preston, that was again a little more complicated, because again, Preston thought that he was just a lesbian. And so when he told us, it's funny, my kids are very, very close, and he had told them 6 months before he told us. And the way he told us was he had long red hair, gorgeous long red hair, and bangs that he would always cover his eyes. And I always kept saying, can you just get a bang trim, because I can't see your face. I can never see your face. You're always covering up your face. Well, now I know why he was covering up his face. So how he told me was, he called us one night and he said, I'm thinking of getting my hair cut. I'm like, great, you need a bang trim. That's fantastic. He sent us pictures the next day, and he had like a crew cut, like his hair was gone. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, okay, I can get it. And little by little, the way he dressed and the way he identified. And then he finally told us. And yeah, I mean, I think the thing that we were most concerned about, other than the fact that, oh my God, he's going to have a hard time, because, being trans is really hard. And we felt he was going to be in a lot more danger, once he came out. But I think I had a harder time when he told me he was getting tattoos. I did when he was, because again, looking back on it, I thought, wow, when he was little, he did used to wear his hair really short. He never really liked dresses that much. He wasn't comfortable with his body. He seemed like he took out all of his, I guess, sadness or aggression in his writing. He would close himself up in his room and write these amazing stories and poetry. And we never really thought about it. But then thinking back, okay, well, maybe we all miss something.
It's interesting, Cantor, that you referred to Preston when he was very young, and these things that happened when he was young, but that was when he was a girl. So you still refer, so you would have called him she at the time.
I'm calling
him now when you talk in the past.
Yeah, I asked him about that. I said, when I refer to you when you were little, he goes, I was always a him. I was always him. So I just didn't acknowledge it until now. What we were worried about, I have to say, is that, we heard all these stories about, trans kids who are like, from the time they're 2 or what, like we thought Jeremy was, they know that they're not in the right body. They know they are sure they rebel, they want to. It wasn't like that with Preston. It was a different way. And we thought, is it something else? Could he be missing something else? Does he really want to do this? Because there's no coming back from this. His was just kind of a gradual sort of revelation, like, oh yeah. it wasn't like this thing that he always knew. So that's what we kept saying, are you sure? You're really sure about this? And he said, I've had, 26 years to think about it. I'm sure.
Yeah, and your children, you're a religious leader and a household that's committed to Judaism. Um,
Mhm.
do you have experiences or friends of your children or just knowledge about the community about people who are on the GLBTQ spectrum and how well they stay connected to Judaism after they come out or identify differently than the straight world?
I think it depends on, where they belong, how they express their Judaism, like Preston wants nothing to do with religion but I think it's not so much because of Judaism necessarily, or like he he grew up in Texas, all my kids grew up in Texas, where a lot of his friends were very, very religious Christians, very, judgmental, and I think that is the kind of thing that was like, oh, religion's not for me. Now, he knows he has choices, CBST and, Francisco, but he still, I think, shies away from that. My other kid, Jeremy has no problem going to synagogue, but I think if you come into a building in a synagogue, or and you're going to be accepted there, and you're going to be treated just as respectfully as anyone else, and there are signs that show you that, I hope that that would hopefully make you feel more connected to your faith, because you have a safe space, which you might not have in the outside world so much. In fact, since really we've become more woke, I guess you could say, our synagogue, there are more LGBTQ people coming. I mean, and younger people coming too, I've noticed. One who is a Bright Divinity School is on campus at TCU, where my husband works, but a divinity student who identifies as they, them. And I met them at a Holocaust remembrance thing at the Divinity School. They're getting an MDiv, right? I said, come, we just, if you want to see, they're very interested in learning about all religions. So they started coming. Now they're going to be teaching a class in Ecclesiastes for us in the spring. They come to all the services. They are, and now they're still in divinity school. But I can see this transition happening, not sexually, but this transition where they're starting to write all their papers from a Christian and a Jewish perspective now. They're writing they're doing double their assignments now. They're talking to rabbis about conversion. I just know, because this person I know would make such an amazing rabbi. And they're in a place where all of a sudden questioning is okay. We can question, we can grapple with our texts. We can, we don't have to just accept what's there, on paper or parchment, I should say. And they feel, and they've been so welcomed there that, they love going there. They love it. And they're taking all kinds of classes online too, with Hadar and, Romamu and all these other, alternative Jewish prayer experiences. There's another one who's gay, and he's Black man who is gay and is converting to Judaism now, and comes to our synagogue all the time, and now even comes with me to morning minyan at a friend's synagogue in Chicago via Zoom, because his father just passed away and he wants to say Kaddish for him for a year. So now we go to minyan together, and he's learning a lot. He's like my Hebrew class. So I think, again, if your vibe is, we love you, we accept you for who you are, then religion can be a very positive experience, in their life, a transformative experience even.
One of the interesting things I think about community in general is that every difference can be looked at in one way or another. Judaism is very big on family, traditional family. And I remember for years going to synagogue as a single man, sometimes questioning, how well do I fit in? Even though I was a straight man, I was single and everyone else was in family. And so our open-heartedness to extend to all kinds of differences, whether they're sexual orientation, socioeconomic, body image, all kinds of things. This is one that is coming out more in the world, no pun intended. And it's just, it's just a matter of looking at people as people,
Yeah.
and having our hearts open as well as we can.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've been very open again about our family and our experiences. When Preston had he had top surgery about 2 years ago. And
You mean the removal of his breast?
yes,
Yeah, top surgery. Yeah.
top surgery. Yes. Yeah. And we did that in Chicago. And he stayed with my mom because my mom has a nice, comfortable house, and much more comfortable than where he was living in New York at the time when I didn't want to schlep out there. We all stayed together. We watched movies all week. It was a lot of fun. And my mom was the one that was like most enthusiastic about taking care of him too. So I would, my congregation walked that path with me, and with us and with those changes. And, now that we have, again, this other non-binary person who has joined our synagogue. They can't literally join the synagogue because they're not Jewish yet, but they're even using the correct pronouns, they, them, all the time with it. I sometimes still misgender. I have to always write down, I like the screens, and that's why I put she, her on my screen too. I like being able to be reminded, okay, they're they, them, don't misgender them. But so they, again, the familiarity is what's so crucial, I think. Just making those connections, forming relationships. You had asked Mr. Sachs, I guess is
Yeah.
how this reflected the relationship between my husband and I, and I think if anything, it's really brought us closer. My husband is the most sensitive, compassionate. I mean, sometimes he says, I'm the gayest straight man you'll ever know, because he was brought up, on our kids, grew up with Judy Garland and Barbara Streisand, and all of his friends are women, and but he's attracted to women, so he's he considers himself heterosexual male, but still he has that the sensitivity and the nature that is kind of his feminine side is very strong. So my kids, that was their role model growing up too, and they love it. He so I think if anything, it really brought us closer. He had I think even an easier time with it, because I still kind of went through that period where, I'm losing my daughter, I'm getting a son, but and he's like, no, you're not. It's the same person. We're just happier with what
Right, he's the same person. So, but one of the things that was a little bit confusing in your story to me is that that you knew certain things about your children when they were 2 and 3 years old, and that's long before someone is sexually active, sexually aroused, and so I wonder sometimes. I've known some families where the children are sort of thinking in gender fluid terms, and do you think that some children go through sort of a mental experimental stage, or it's confusing to me to think about being gay or straight if your sexuality is long before puberty.
I think, though, that there's a difference, again, between, you're talking more about sexual orientation, who they're attracted to, and that, kids can go through experimental stages and things like that, but who they are, their gender identity, how they see themselves, I think that's like from birth. Think about back to the time like you were in preschool or kindergarten. I had this huge crush on Kenny Gorlick when I was like 5. I wasn't attracted to girls. I liked little boys, and that's not something that you learn. You just are. I mean, that's just who you are. So, I do believe that these kids, when they're very, very young, and they're just like, I don't want to be in it. What's that doing there? Like how many of us ever question that? You're either comfortable in your body and who you are, or you feel, I think trans kids, they just feel it's, no, this is just not, this is a big cosmic mistake. And I do truly believe that, because I've seen enough, examples that I've heard and read, and, research enough people that do, which is why it was kind of, I was worried about Preston, because he didn't feel like that, really. He kind of grew into that. But yeah, I think that's different. And that is very, and it's hard to be able to separate that from sexual orientation, who you're attracted to. But look, if Jeremy, kept going the way he was going, I assumed he's trans. He wants to be a girl. So I think that, yeah, kids do know. You just, before you know anything about sexual attraction, about what you have a sense of who you are.
Cantor.
And so a lot of this information, looking at the difference between gender identity and orientation and those kind of things is really important for all of us to recognize those differences. Yeah. Thank you.
And just I know that we're a little bit over time, but before, if I can just indulge you for a few minutes, I want to tell you just what, kind of what I've learned in terms of what our synagogue does now, to try to be more inclusive. Because, again, I got pushback at first when I said we need to be able to say that we are welcoming to all genders and sexual orientations. Like, well, we say in our statement here, in our, whatever it is, our website, that we are welcome to all. Why do we have to go any further than that? I'm like, how? How are you welcome? How are we welcome to all? What are we doing? It's one thing to say it, but what are we doing? So I really, it took a few years, because again, you're right. It takes time for people to absorb, to change, especially when they're not used to this, all so new. But we eventually, this past summer, had, via Zoom, gender awareness training. There's a trans woman in Dallas, from the Learning Center in Dallas, and then Leslie McMurray, who did a great job on Zoom, kind of defining all of these things for us and making sure that we know, so that when people walk in the building and maybe we're not sure how they identify, we can say, oh, hi, I'm Cantor Sheri Ellen. I go by pronouns she, her, hers. What about you? So right away, they know where they are. We've changed the wording on our membership and religious school forms. So we don't have, we have parent, or, we have spouse. We don't have husband and wife anymore. I told you we changed the Gabbai guide. My sermons often reflect, LGBTQ awareness. We also joined, I love you to join, we have the thing called the Inclusive Faith Coalition of Arlington, Texas. It's basically just a website with a bunch of churches and us now, where people that are wanting to find welcoming congregations can just go online, and there's a list, and here we are. And we have this holy covenant that we know that we take, saying of all the things that we do in our congregations to make you feel welcome. So we're a member of that. I'm on Keshet's. They have an equality directory. So if a Jewish person wants to go online and just say, I'm going to be visiting San Francisco, no, that's probably, I'm going to be visiting Idaho. What synagogues in Idaho are going to be welcoming to me? And the Keshet guide has all of, these listed. I'm listed in that as well. I always mark LGBTQ celebrations and days of mourning at Shabbat services. Usually I have readings that reflect that day or that time. My sermon is usually is framed by what that occasion is. And like I said, I try to normalize as much as possible all of, I just try to make my life, and my experiences, my children, this is normal life for me, and it's fantastic. And I couldn't be prouder of my kids, and all of them are such allies. My son Jeremy is out and proud, going to public high school after he had a sheltered existence in Jewish day school for a long time. He had such a strong self-identity that, you know, it got to the point that senior year, I told you he was a fashion maven, he started wearing his ties as belts. And like the gang members will come up and go, hey, Jeremy, nice tie. I like your use of the tie, you know? So he was like, thanks, you know? And then, you know, Emily does all this photography for the community. And I was also a member of GLSEN, which trains, you know, in schools, kids and parents and staff to be aware of these issues when they come up in schools. And of course, Preston is a huge advocate, and all of them are so supportive of each other. And I think that just fostering that and not making assumptions and making sure that you ask questions, because there are times that I've really screwed up. You know, I've gotten information wrong, and you know, Preston got to the point where you were misgendering him, you know, too often, and he was going on a trip with my husband Richard to Disneyland right before his surgery. He said he wanted to have one big, you know, it was Disney World. And he said, Dad, every time you misgender me, you're buying me a drink at Disney World. And, you know, that helped. But again, just practicing it and making it, just the familiarity is just so important. Get to know your LGBTQ neighbors and friends and family.
Well, among the most important things you said was the B'Tselem Elohim, you know, that we're all created in the image of God. And it's very interesting. We can do a whole study sometime on the creation of Adam as male and female. He created them. It's you know, it's all very fascinating. And I'm wondering if there are any other questions from the community.
See, Dale has one about.
Dale, did you want to unmute and ask?
Yeah.
Well, no, I didn't have a question. I just, the difference in bisexual and pansexual, to me, I've known both. Even before the term pansexual was around, the bisexual lady I knew, she would go with men or women, but she would never consider going with trans or the other identities. Whereas the guy that was pansexual, he dated men and women, drag queens, trans men, trans women, and we never knew who he would be with next. And this was way before pansexual.
So yeah, so he was pansexual before the term, I guess, was exactly. Again, pansexual really means just being attracted to the human being, not what sexual orientation, gender identity they are, just to the person. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think one of the things that, you know, that I've learned in my 20 plus years as a rabbi is that everyone is different. And that sometimes people fit into labels, and sometimes we could be label fluid as well. You know, when I started working with interfaith families, I realized that each one had a different way that they expressed how multiple faiths were involved in their family. And so I think that treating each human being differently in the way he, she, or they want to be treated, and that can be fluid too. That people may, you know, may change how they want to be connected. So it's it's a wonderful, just a wonderful exploration. And you talked about I always thought that the Q in LGBTQ was questioning rather than queer.
That could be that. I mean, Q can be questioning too, I think. Yeah.
Yes, which is the hallmark of Judaism, as you said, with some of your people who are looking, who are exploring Judaism. So thank you very much, Cantor Allen. This session is recorded, so it will be available to those who wish to view it again and those who didn't get a chance to view it. And anybody who's interested in the handout that the descriptions that she had provided, you could just email me and I'll get back to you. Or if you want to contact Cantor Allen herself, I can certainly get you that information.
Absolutely. You can feel free to contact me. Rabbi Gordon has my contact information, and I'll be happy to stay on a few more minutes after the session is over if anyone has any other questions. I know that.
Sure. I'll leave the room open for those who want to schmooze. I'll just add a couple of quick announcements. We are having our December 25th Shabbat service on December 25th. So anybody who is not, well, it doesn't matter what you're doing, just come and pray with us on Christmas. If you choose, we'll also have a January 1st service. So however you celebrate December. Oh, there's Serge. Hi, Serge. Yeah, we got a new dog. We got a new dog for the next week. So that's very exciting. All right. So anybody who just wants to schmooze, I'm going to turn the recording off for now. And thanks for being here.